So it's been a while since I talked about Andrew Yang, but I do want to take some time to focus on his campaign because he's surging. I think that Andrew Yang is someone who is very personable. I think he's running a dynamic campaign, and it's easy to see why he has a lot of momentum. And let me just say this, seeing him surpass Kamala Harris in at least one poll in California, it warms my heart because we all love an underdog story. We love seeing, a corporate Democrat, an establishment-backed candidate be surpassed by someone who is largely an outsider, and I absolutely love it. But what's interesting is that, my response to Andrew Yang has been either hot or cold. Sometimes I vehemently disagree with him. Other times I agree with him. Overall, I like him. I just think he's a nice person, but politically, I've come to realize that I think the reason why, I'm so hot and cold, or hot or cold on Andrew Yang is because we have different worldviews, and sometimes our worldviews overlap. Other times, our worldviews clash. He's a capitalist, and he doesn't deny that. He says he's a capitalist, but I'm a socialist. I do kind of view Andrew Yang as someone who leans libertarian. I don't think it would be fair to describe him as a libertarian, but I think it's safe to say that he does have some libertarian tendencies, especially when it comes to economic issues, and that's really where I take issue with him on. So, for example, I like UBI, but I don't like that he'd fund his freedom dividend using a VAT tax, which is generally a regressive tax. And I also don't like that that program is opt-in, because I don't think that it's fair to force poor people to choose between UBI and food stamps when rich people aren't going to have to make that decision. If it's universal, it should just be universal, no questions asked. But, that's some worldview differences. However, that doesn't mean that Andrew Yang's more libertarian tendencies are always bad, because there's one policy that is fairly libertarian or progressive, it's a little bit of a combination of both, that he recently endorsed that I absolutely love. This is what he said on the Hill about decriminalization of drugs.
I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. Does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. At this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin,
right,
which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done? Because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. Is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites. And I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail and letting them know this.
So that right there is absolutely remarkable. And look, he deserves a lot of credit for that. And he's even outflanking Bernie on this issue. Credit where it's due. This is fantastic. And this is why I really like candidates like Andrew Yang being included in this race, because they bring new ideas to the table and then they force other candidates to compete with them from the left. So I like what he's doing. I love that he took that stand. And, you can see why this is popular and also why strategically this is smart, because this is something that would be appealing to libertarians because it promotes individual liberty, but simultaneously it also promotes progress. So you see the overlap there. Progressives and libertarians can obviously get behind something like that. So I love that he came out and said that he'd like to model our drug policies after Portugal's. And, on the subject of individual liberty, he recently also came out in favor of classifying digital data as personal property, which I think is a great idea. And it's why I'm so glad that he's in the race, even if he's not my number one. So, when I agree with him wholeheartedly usually. And, I absolutely am ecstatic about some of the ideas that he's bringing to the table. But, he does tend to inexplicably betray what I perceive to be libertarian leaning tendencies by endorsing policies that are just, nonsensical, in my opinion, that are against the First Amendment, that would otherwise be backed by like establishment candidates, and I can't fathom why he would take this position. Case in point, here's what he said about Julian Assange.
Do you support Julian Assange?
I think Julian Assange should stand trial. I am generally pro whistleblower and pro people that try and call out bad behaviors. But in that particular case, he did end up disclosing some information that really had no useful purpose except for potential damage to our infrastructure, like the undersea cables location and some other things. So I certainly would not be in favor of I think he should stand trial.
Thank you.
So that's a big yikes for me. That's a big yikes for me. Now, say what you will about Julian Assange. I've talked about this on the channel before. This is not about Julian Assange, in my view. This is about protecting the First Amendment, protecting whistleblowers, allowing our government to be challenged by journalists and, holding our government accountable for war crimes that we're committing. So the fact that he would take that position, it doesn't make sense to me because it seems like he's intentionally trying to undercut his libertarian appeal in order to cater to the more establishment demographic within the Democratic Party, primary base. But on top of that, he was recently on a CNBC reporter's podcast, and what he said about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, I found very disturbing.
The Republican economists I talked to, who praised the efficiency of what you proposed, contrasted it with the wealth tax that Sanders and Warren have talked about and said that just won't work. It won't raise the money. It will trigger a lot of evasion. There are measurement problems. Do you agree with that? Do you think the wealth tax is a bad idea?
I think the wealth tax is an idea and spirit that makes sense given the wealth distribution, but in practice, it would have massive implementation problems. There would be capital flight. Wealthy people would renounce their citizenship. And the bigger problem isn't even the money. It's the annual inventorying of their assets. That the truly wealthy in this country have zero interest in submitting to an annual audit of all of their assets. They barely know what all their assets are. And the last thing they're going to do is report them every year and then pay a toll. So you would have massive compliance problems. And to me, there are better ways to make this economy fair. Though I understand the spirit of it and the intent of it, but I agree that it would be somewhere between problematic and a disaster in practice.
So to say that a wealth tax would be somewhere between problematic and a disaster in practice, I think that that's harmful for left-wing discourse because that's not true. That is not true. And the person who brought this question to your attention was citing what Republican economists say about that. Of course, they're going to say that a wealth tax is harmful because Republicans, they are the elitist party that looks out for the well-being of elites and the wealthy. If they don't want to conduct yearly audits, then throw them in jail. I mean, be harsh. You have to crack skulls as president, especially when it comes to elites, because they have too much power. So we have to rein them in and understand that this is class warfare that we're talking about. This is not a war that was started by the poor. This was started by elites. But I mean, for him to say that a wealth tax could be a disaster tells me that he'd be willing to let the wealthy off after they've robbed the poor blindly for decades. And I find that egregious. I find that egregious because think about this. Why is it that we only think about what elites want when we're designing policies? Do we ever consider what normal Americans want? I mean, what? More than 80% of the country didn't want net neutrality to be repealed, but it was still repealed anyway. A majority of the country wants Medicare for all, but we're still not doing it. But when we start talking about policies that impact elites directly, then we have to consider, oh, well, maybe they won't like that. Too fucking bad. They can leave the country, fuck them. We don't need them in our country because these are thieves. What they are doing is a form of theft because you can't possibly become a multi-billionaire. You can't amass millions of dollars in wealth unless you steal from your workers, unless you exploit labor. That is theft. So forgive me for not caring about what these elites want. And I find it really frustrating that Andrew Yang would actually legitimize that right-wing narrative because we need a wealth tax. It's time that we tax these dickheads and start reinvesting the wealth that they're hoarding into the economy so we can help normal Americans. Now, that's not to say that he is against helping normal Americans, because of course he's running on the freedom dividend, right? So I believe that he believes he has the best strategy to help Americans. But you need really a strong structural change platform, and part of that means getting this wealth back that elites stole from Americans. That's completely crucial. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't like Andrew Yang. I think that it's really important that if you disagree with a politician, you lob constructive criticism against them, because no politician is perfect. We should prioritize policy over personalities. So when it comes to Marianne Williamson, I absolutely love that she elevated the issue of reparations. I love that. She's better than Bernie on that issue. Does that mean I support her overall? No, I don't like that she doesn't support single-payer Medicare for all. I like that Tulsi Gabbard elevates the issue of ending regime change wars. I just wish that she would also support single-payer Medicare for all and talk about ending the drone wars and ending U.S. imperialism and closing down our military bases. Bernie Sanders is phenomenal on a number of issues. He is great when it comes to the issue of LGBTQIA plus rights, but I want him to commit to legalizing sex work. I want him to get on board with a policy like the one that Andrew Yang supports, where you decriminalize opiates. I think that that would be fantastic. So this isn't about, protecting the candidates that we like. This is about saying, if you're going to represent us, then I want you to listen to my criticism. And the good thing about Andrew Yang is that I do like that he does seem inclined to listen to criticism. Because when I brought him on my show and I told him about the worries that I had with the way that he was implementing UBI, a month or so later, probably not because of me, but a month or so later, he changed his policy to kind of address the criticism that me and others were using to talk about his form of UBI. And I find that incredibly admirable. So this is why, during these primary races, we want this to be a race to the top. We don't want this to be a race to the bottom. And part of that is really keeping these candidates in check. So while I like Andrew Yang, while some of his ideas are fantastic, I am not going to bite my tongue and, not criticize him if he says something that I think is harmful. But, on the other side of the same coin, if he does something that's great and he implements a policy that I really, really like, or promotes a policy that I really like, then I'm going to say, that's awesome. I hope you pressure Bernie to, adopt that policy. Like, I want them to go tit for tat, right? Elizabeth Warren proposes student loan debt cancellation, then Bernie one-ups her and proposes 100% student loan debt cancellation. This is what primaries are about. And the reason why I'm talking so much about, why we should not gatekeep and allow criticism of candidates is because what we're seeing right now online is a lot of people lash out when they see their candidates critiqued, be it Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and even Bernie Sanders to a degree. But politicians are running because they're saying that they want to serve us. So they can demonstrate that they are committed to serving us during the primary based on how well they respond to criticism. And thankfully, Andrew Yang has been one of the few candidates who has responded positively to constructive criticism. So if I see area for improvement, I'm going to tell him about it.
Mike is a total loser, so don't hit the subscribe button, okay? And whatever you do, folks, do not hit the notification bell either. Mike treats me so unfairly.